critically analyzing global affairs. The Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, it's just gone 12 noon in London, 7 a.m. in Philadelphia, and around the world, it's time for the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. Welcome back. Here on the Muckrakers, we pledge to continue tackling the most pressing and controversial news issues of our time. Our mission, as always, is to provide more light and less heat on the various areas that really matter to you. And we always aim to inform, educate, and entertain with dignity and respect. And as always, I emphasize it's vital we don't just ask the questions, but question those answers. Well, today we're going to be looking at the latest developments in the Ukraine conflict, and to help me do that, I'm delighted to be joined by TNT Titan James Freeman, who's still got his hair in a man bun, and Professor Glenn Diesen. How are you, gentlemen?
Very good, Andrew.
Very good, thanks.
Good. And good to see you, Glenn. Glenn's in Oslo at the moment. His children, all three children, have gone back to school. But he's a Norwegian academic and political scientist. He's been on the Muckrakers before, which is lovely. He's also a professor at University of Southeastern Norway and an associate editor at the Russia in Global Affairs Journal. Professor Diesen's main research focuses Russian foreign policy, geoeconomics, conservatism, and Eurasian integration. And today, gentlemen, I want to look at the latest in Ukraine, and there are various reports and various stories going around. Let me just run you through some of them and then get your insight on this. Basically, Zelensky has stated he's got the F-16 fighter jets, which have recently deployed in Ukraine. They were used to shoot down Russian missiles during heavy attacks, and he's called on yet more jets and pilot training. Interesting stuff. Ukraine's army chief has also reported significant gains in the Kursk region, and he claims control over 100 towns and villages. He stated that Ukraine has taken 594 Russian prisoners of war, and that Russia has deployed about 30,000 troops in response. Also, there's been a Ukrainian ballistic missile test. Zelensky has announced that Ukraine tested its first domestically produced ballistic missile, and separately he mentioned the successful use of the new missile drone. Glenn, let me come to you first, because as I say, we're also heavily reliant on reports that come out, and we always know that the first casualty in war is the truth. What's your understanding of the current situation?
Well, I think the Ukrainians were a bit went for a big gamble, because they saw that every day their relative power vis-a-vis the Russians was weakening. And so as Western, Ukrainian, as well as Russian observers recognized, this incursion into Kursk was obviously a huge gamble. It had many different objectives. They wanted to divert Russian troops from Donbass. They wanted to perhaps capture the Kursk nuclear power plant as a bargaining chip. They, of course, wanted to create panic in Russia, hit some of its deep defenses, logistics, and as Western media keeps telling us, the great objective of trying to humiliate Putin, as the public might turn on him. So there was. I saw it as I see this as a last-ditch effort to change the course of the war, but I think. Quite predictably, it has turned out to be a huge mistake as well, because they're burning through all their best manpower and equipment, which they sorely need in other places.
Yeah, you make an excellent point. And this was supposed to be the great distraction, wasn't it? You're basically trying to get resources elsewhere, use this as a bargaining position to try and negotiate peace. What's your take on it, James?
Yeah, I always kind of come back to basics and just try and ask, what is the end game? And it's very, very confusing at the moment, I think. I mean, NATO leaders, particularly in Europe, keep on talking about the fact that Ukraine is going to win this with the help of the West. Zelensky doesn't seem so sure. There was a press conference on Tuesday where he announced a big new plan in terms of winning the war. But winning the war in terms of that plan isn't actually winning the war. It's actually forcing dialogue and then peace negotiations. In what he says, the reason they're still pushing hard is because they want to have the upper hand in those negotiations. So all very, very confusing. And I think also I had Dr. Gilbert Doctorow on yesterday, who's an expert on Russian affairs. And He has said, you know, the discussions in political circles in Russia are very, very concerned at the moment. They're concerned about some of the weapons that America is talking about giving Ukraine, like the JASSM missiles, which have a range, I think, up to, there's two variants, but one of them have a range of up to 900 kilometers, which could reach Russian air bases, which is moved deep into its territory to avoid exactly that. There's also discussion in Russia, quite paranoid, I think, but maybe not, about the two aircraft carriers and their sort of support groups in the Eastern Mediterranean, the US aircraft carriers. And actually, there's question marks now over whether they're really there to contain Iran or whether they actually are there for a strike on Russia. So I think, you know, the picture that I got from Gilbert Doctorow yesterday was that actually we're moving into a very, very dangerous phase of this conflict, where Russia is becoming increasingly worried about attacks on its own territory. And, you know, we've heard lots of talk about tactical nuclear weapons being used. So, you know, that is, I think, where we're heading at the moment. You know, Russia has been clear. They've drawn red line after red line. And, you know, these attacks that seem to be moving into Russia, and now the talk of these long-term weapons, I think should be alarming to people in the West.
Yeah, so some excellent points. And as Glenn mentioned at the very beginning, a lot of this is a tactic to try and force the negotiation, because it's humiliating for Putin to have Ukrainian troops on his territory. Do you think it's going to be effective, Glenn?
No, I think it's quite on the contrary. I think, if anything, it changed the format of the war. Whatever some Russians might think about this, what they refer to as a special military operation in Ukraine, this is now seen to be a war of national liberation, in which they were invaded. And again, not only by Ukraine, but this is quite evidently that NATO is involved in this as well. Then, especially the United States providing a lot of the intelligence. So I think, if anything, it creates pressure on Putin to perhaps do more about this idea that the Russians will rise up, topple the leader, and we will have a regime change and the West can claim victory. I think this is a dream. But I agree with that NATO should be cautious about some of the provocations, because keep in mind, much like in the Middle East, where Israel's trying to pull in America to save the day into a bigger war, similarly, Ukrainians have the same incentive. If I was Ukrainian, certainly I would want to pull in NATO as well to have some allies in this fight against Russia. But it's worth noting that the reason why we're not in a direct war with Russia, a third world war now, is because NATO pretends it's not involved in the war, and the Russians are pretending as if they're not being attacked by NATO. As long as both sides keep pretending, we can avoid this. The problem is when you have this continuous escalation, and now with NATO's involvement in the invasion of Russia, as well as now supplying long-range missiles, and I guess the Americans will only hold out for a little bit before they approve of this. It's going to be very hard not to get into a direct war anymore, because the idea that NATO's going to supply missiles, help with the targeting and even management of some of these weapon systems, and begin bombing Moscow, for example, and they won't respond. To me, this is simply unthinkable. So I think as we're moving towards the end phase of this war, as we see now a collapse across the Ukrainian front lines, the war will go into its most dangerous stage, as it's either now all in and effectively a direct war with Russia, or we have to accept that we have been defeated, that this decade-long proxy war against Russia has come to an end.
Yeah, and you make some interesting points about pretense of NATO not being involved. I mean, if I take one example, these F-16 planes, these fighter planes, it takes months, if not years, to train to be a pilot of these. And there was a call for ex-pilots, if you like, in the US to come forward and help fly these things. Surely that means that they're already involved, doesn't it, James?
Of course it does. A lot of these attacks are based upon Western satellite intelligence, Western communications intelligence. Russia knows this. Ukraine hasn't got that. These types of weapons and this type of intelligence. But look, if we look at what Zelensky is saying and what people in the West are saying, that, we can humiliate Putin and force negotiations. Think about that for a second. Those of us who really know what's going on know that this war didn't start in 2022. We know that for the best part of 2 decades, NATO has been slowly encircling Russia, getting closer and closer, even after it promised not to do this. So why would anybody in Russia think that sort of surrendering to negotiations will actually get them anything at the table? I think, I don't think there's any trust in Russia for NATO and its objectives. So I think, to be honest with you, this is a case of backing Putin and the Russian establishment into a corner. That's what's happening here. And we all know what happens when you corner a wild animal in a corner. They lash out. And I think that's the danger. That is the danger now, is that Russia gets to a point where it sees no option whatsoever unless it just gives up, then having an attack. And Moldova, for example, is hosting some of these F-16s, according to rumours. Moldova isn't part of NATO, so maybe that's the country it attacks as a warning. But I think there is an attack coming if NATO continues with this provocation.
Yeah. Glenn, what's your take on that?
No, I agree completely, because, imagine if the tables were turned when we invaded Iraq or Syria or Libya or any other country. Imagine if the Russians would have supplied all these long-range missiles to strike, for example, within Britain, using Russian missiles, using Russian intelligence, Russian target selection, then would then supply Russian fighter jets, which would then be manned by so-called Russian volunteers, but fighting under, for example, a Libyan flag. What would we say? Would we say, well, I guess they have the right for self-defense, as the UK would be struck by missiles and bombed? Of course not. This would be seen as an act of war by Russia. And this is why I've also argued this is an act of war by NATO. And the only reason why we're not in a world war is because both sides are pretending as if we're not. But this pretense is going away. But I do agree, like Russia will... the failure to retaliate, it's becoming more and more dangerous, because it then emboldens the adversary if there is no response. And but I do think that their retaliations now, and they are coming, will attempt to avoid a direct car clash with NATO. So, for example, bombing the F-16s in Moldova, I think, is very likely, because then NATO wouldn't have to respond, but the message would still be received. So it's an escalation, but we could still avoid a nuclear exchange. So I think we have to go all the way to the brink of a nuclear war before there would be willingness for anyone to take a step back, I think.
Yeah, and Andrew, let me just butt in there as well. The other thing is, I think it seems to be a tactic, not an explicit one, but that NATO almost wants Russia to attack in some way, so that it can say to the rest of the world, oh, look, there you go, evil Putin, we need to do something about Russia, they're clearly out of control. I think, looking at the situation, it seems to be part of NATO's strategy, hoping that Russia will do something like that, which again, I think is extremely dangerous. But I think, to sum up, I mean, I still don't see any coherent end game being communicated by the West. I really, really don't. All of the talk of Ukraine winning this war and Russia will be defeated is just nonsense. That will end in a nuclear conflict. That's it. So I'm still confused about what the Western strategy is here. Do we think that the Russian people will get rid of Putin? I think that's unlikely. If NATO wanted to isolate Russia, well, that's failed, because after it stole all of Russian US dollar reserves from the SWIFT system, well, what's happened? Countries around the world have said, hang on, if the US is going to do that to Russia, well, they might do that to us. And so that action has actually pushed Russia into the hands of China, into the hands of Iran, Saudi Arabia. And so everything the West has done seems to be making the situation worse. So I'm just really, really confused. Like I said, I'm not quite sure what the end game is in terms of the West.
Well, we're going to unpack that a little bit more and look at the different options. Also look at the US position, the support which continues to be given by the current Biden administration. They don't have too long to go. And we're also going to look at the cursed nuclear plant, and maybe let's see what the options are towards a path for peace. All of that coming up after these messages.